In the last couple of videos, we built a new battery pack and charger for the Epson HX-20. When we powered on the computer, we got the double beep indicating that the HX-20 was starting, but we got nothing on the display. From past experience, I know that this relates to the old electrolytic capacitors which may have leaked or gone bad. As this computer is 35 years old, there's a high probability that these capacitors have gone bad. So to save some time in the future, I'm going to replace all these capacitors. When sourcing replacing capacitors for this computer, we need to make sure they are low profile, as if they are too tall we'll be unable to close the case. One good thing about purchasing new capacitors nowadays is that they tend to be smaller than the capacitors that you're replacing. This is because capacitor technology has improved over the last 30 to 40 years. On the component layout diagram, I have highlighted in yellow all the capacitors that I'll be replacing. Here I have listed the various capacitors that will need to be replaced. If you find it difficult to source the value for the same voltage rating, just remember you can go up in voltage rating when looking for a replacement. Just remember to keep the capacitor value the exact same. Just watch out for changes in physical dimensions when you go up in voltage rating, as these tend to be a little wider. Opening the HX-20 is a matter of simply removing 6 screws in the bottom of the case. Care must be taken when separating the two halves of the HX-20 so not to damage the ribbon cable on the microcassette drive. I would generally open the HX-20 from the top of the computer. Once you've disconnected the ribbon cable from the microcassette drive, you can then open the computer flat. When opening the computer, take care as there are 2 more ribbon cables on the bottom of the case, which join the computer to the main PCB. Release both connectors so you can then remove the keyboard PCB from the main PCB. We now can begin to remove the main PCB from the bottom portion of the case. Disconnect the battery connector from the main PCB first. Remove the screws that hold the battery cover in place. We can then remove the battery cover plate and then remove the battery. We can then remove the screws that hold the shield for the main PCB in place. There are only 2 of these screws. There are also 2 screws that hold the printer in place, which you can see at the top of the printer. We can now disconnect the flex connector for the inbuilt printer from the main PCB. Once these have been removed, we can then remove the printer and then the shield. There are only 3 screws left holding the main PCB in place. Once we remove these screws, we can then remove the main PCB. When trying to remove old parts, I find that if I add fresh solder to the component joint, it becomes a little bit easier to remove the part. With old solder joints, they may have become tarnished. As such, you may need to hold the tip of the soldering iron on the joint for a longer time. This is where you need to be careful, as if the joint gets too hot, you may lift the pad or trace from the PCB. This is where you need to take your time and watch out to see if the joint is beginning to flow before it gets too hot or before you do damage. You may need to go back to the joint several times. From the underside of this capacitor, we can see it has leaked. I suspect we're going to see the same situation with all the other capacitors on the board. When we remove the next capacitor, we can see this one has leaked. I'm definitely going to be replacing all the capacitors on the PCB. I won't show you me replacing all the capacitors, as this will take some time. One tip you may find helpful is to add some fresh flux gel to a stubborn joint, as this will help to wet the joint and help the solder flow. It sometimes will help burn off any contaminant that is preventing the joint from flowing. After removing old parts, the next step that I always follow is to wash down the component location with isopropyl alcohol, or IPA. This will help to remove the capacitor electrolyte from the PCB, as well as any other contaminants that may exist. Some old PCBs may have been coated with a PCB lacquer, so when you heat up this joint, this can release contaminants which will prevent a new joint from forming. I always make sure to wash both sides of the PCB with IPA. We're now ready to reassemble the computer to see if it's worked. We reinsert the PCB back into the bottom portion of the case. We then drop back into shield and we have the screws for the PCB. We can then reposition the printer and fix it with its own screws. We reattach the battery. We add the battery shield and screw it back into place. We now line up the keyboard and connect its flex connectors back into the main PCB. We close back up the computer and test again. Still no screen activity, so we have more faults on this computer. You may remember from an earlier video on replacing the battery, we noticed some corrosion on the LCD flex connector. We open back up the case, and when we look at the top portion of the case, we can see 4 screws holding the LCD in place. Let's remove these screws and take out the LCD and have a look at it. When we hold the flex connector up to the light, we can see gaps in the tracks. So this flex connector will need to be repaired or replaced.